appreciate you guys joining us today. We're going to be talking a little bit more about theoretical versus probable threats and how to tailor your security strategy. My name is Jackson Crockrell. I'm going to be the moderator for our session today. I'll be able to help bounce any questions or being able to support the discussion as we're moving forward. Our speaker today is going to be Ascent's very own Jason Floyd. Jason currently serves as Chief Innovation Officer at Ascent, where he leads all activities around innovation, future operations when it comes to everything security technology related. So with that being said, I am going to turn it over to Jason. Jason, you ready to do this?
I am. And Jackson went through some of the introductions, so I'm going to go ahead and jump straight to the content. So cybersecurity is not very important. It's a pretty hot take. This was a paper written by Andrew Lodsko, who was one of my professors in my master's program. He teaches at the University of Minnesota. Interesting background. He actually takes his cybersecurity expertise from a mathematician point of view. So that's his primary discipline. And as he continued to look into the field, he really wanted to walk on to a mathematical validation of cybersecurity. The short story is there wasn't one, and ended up writing this paper, Cybersecurity is not very important. It's not a nihilistic paper by any means or fatalistic in its approach. Eventually, he advocates for resilience over traditional cybersecurity approaches. As resilience, at least we can come back and walk on to some sort of reason, some sort of math that we can validate why we're doing what we're doing in the field. I think it's a really interesting paper. It's actually a point of view that's growing in the field in general, which is trying to turn on its head the way in which we've done things for so long. But whether we take this approach or we take a handful of other approaches, it really begs us to look a little bit deeper into why we do what we do. And if there's a better way in order for us to validate benchmarks or validate specific control frameworks, ways in which we determine that we're going to take a certain cybersecurity approach over another. So that brings me into a pretty common story. This person here is the astute board member, and maybe it's not really astute as much as vocal, maybe a little bit over-informed. But it's the board member who asks a pretty critical question. It seems to be primarily the ransomware question, but you could insert Conti with Log4j or any one of the other major vulnerabilities that have come out over the past couple of years. And it's a very basic open-ended question. They raise their hand. So I heard about Conti. Are we protected? The answer to that is not really as binary as we want to be able to say. You know, that question may be directed at the CEO, and then what does the CEO do? Whispers over to the CISO, are we protected? And then the CISO does the same thing to the security architect, are we protected? Down to the analyst, are we protected? And the analyst says, yeah, of course we're protected. We have CrowdStrike. We have Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. We have Azure Active Directory. And then it goes back up, anecdotally. Yeah, we're protected. We're protected because we've invested in XY technology. Technologies are great, but it really doesn't answer the core of the question, which is how do we know that we're protected? We need something much more substantive to anchor on. And we need something much more quantitative and defensible for us to be able to continue to articulate how we implement controls and how we invest things in our field. So that brings us to risk. I firmly believe that risk is at the core of what we do as security technologists. I put myself in that bucket. I'm primarily a security technologist. As I've said before, as the Chief Innovation Officer of Ascent Solution, I'm our Senior Security Technologist. And in that space, I observe throughout my peers, I observe throughout the industry that the preponderance of the field has kind of walked away from risk as the primary portion of our discipline. I say risk articulation, management, and mitigation is at the core of what the security technologist brings to the field. It is the core of our discipline. But we've seemed to leave this in favor of budget articulation, or articulating other things that are tangential to security. Security technologists tend a little bit more to the skeptic of what if scenarios rather than disciplined art and science of risk. This is really validated by what we see at the primary portions of conferences. RSA, Black Hat, great conferences, love to go to them. But there's very little on risk. And we've substituted risk for value propositions and t-shirt cannons, and have seemed to gone away from the core of what I believe is our discipline. And as we think about theoretical versus probable, we can't really walk on to the core of that, which foreshadowing is a threat component. But I can't even walk onto threat until we're aligned on risk, and we're aligned on the key challenges that risk articulation face in our organizations. So when I say risk, I mean something very, very specific. So not to reduce us all the way back to the traumas of 8th grade algebra, but risk means something very specific to me when I say it. It means a art and a science, and the science is formulaic. It is something that I can add up. It is something that I can quantify. It is something that I can put some numbers around, ideally. You'll see here that we have the risk framework that Ascent primarily uses. It is risk equals threat times vulnerability times asset. An asset is often substituted for consequence in vernacular. Those have actual meanings. They have actual numbers, and that model is really common. It is the most common, I think, formula in the discipline itself, primarily used by the Department of Homeland Security. But the physical security discipline often uses this framework. There's other formulas out there that are really just as good and easy to use, but this is by far the most common. Risk equals threat times vulnerability times asset. And vulnerability has its own subcomponents. Vulnerability is severity times likelihood. Likewise, threat is capability times intent. All of those together are what we need in order to calculate risk. And this is a core portion of the challenge. I mentioned that I believe that risk articulation is the core of the security technologist's role. However, when I go into a lot of organizations, what regularly happens is when I ask them about risks, inevitably what's repeated back to me is vulnerability, which is part of the reason why I feel like we've gone away from this a little bit. Vulnerabilities are just a component of risk. The easiest way for me to be able to articulate this is I live a little bit out in the country. I rarely lock my car. I rarely lock the door of my house. That may be a bad idea. I'll certainly acknowledge that that's a vulnerability. And the asset is my house, something I care very much about. My family that lives within the side of the house, something I very much care about. But the reason I infrequently lock my car or the door of my house is because I don't perceive there to be a threat. The capability might be there. There's a lot of people out there that are capable of breaking into my home, or my car, especially when it's not locked. But the intent isn't there. The intent isn't there, at least in where I live. So anybody who knows my address, I suppose I just gave away a major vulnerability. But all of that together is I assess that the risk is not there. I assess that the risk is not there, therefore I take a specific action. And it centers not only around a full risk articulation, but even more so around the threat, and even more tightly around the intent of that threat. Because of that, I assess a full risk portion. So we're going to dive into this a little bit more. But first, I'm going to bring forward a handful of reasons. Maybe these resonate with you. I hope they do, on why organizations today are probably challenged with risk. The first is the field is very young. It is worth recognizing that in the grand scheme of time, the field of cybersecurity technology is very short. I've often said that I believe that we are at, in cybersecurity, the same space as medicine was a few hundred years ago when we were still bleeding people because we thought that it made them better. There's probably a lot of things that we're doing that, looking back, we're going to say is arcane. But the field is young. So it stands to reason that we are still very much learning in the infancy of the field, and we're learning along the way. And there's going to be a lot of things that change within the next 2 to 3, 5, 10 years. We'll probably look back and realize that we're doing things very different 10 years from now. And the things that we're doing currently are probably going to be very errant in many ways because the field is young. Another reason is I think that silver bullet solutions have become the norm. When I say these silver bullet solutions, you'll see that a lot of security technology value propositions center around, this is the thing that you'll buy that will save your security, fill in the blank. We all know that MDRs aren't going to save everything about your company, that data protection solution isn't holistically a cybersecurity solution, that there's a bunch of other things that you need to fill out in your capabilities. But they're articulated as silver bullet solutions to change the way in which you do everything. And it's just not that simple. Another one is compliance frameworks. Compliance is important. I'm certainly not here to denigrate compliance. But we've experienced, we as an industry, not just me or not just Ascent, we as an industry experience that compliance frameworks almost always fall behind security. But they've kind of taken over the industry. It is really easy to articulate why I need something for my ISO or NIST or CIS or PCI compliance assessment, when in reality that control may be for a threat of 5-10 years ago. And on the flip side, it can be really difficult for me to articulate how risky a emerging threat is to our organization when it's not fully specified in something like a compliance framework. But they've really taken over the way in which we think about things, and they've definitely taken over our budgeting cycles. In like manner, the insurance industry, and for those of you that are in the insurance industry, certainly not denigrating the entire field as a whole, but I think we all will acknowledge that the cybersecurity insurance is still quite flawed. For anybody who's filled out one of those applications, whether or not you do MFA just isn't a binary answer. I can't say yes or no. How many of the privileged users are on MFA, and what is the percentage of people on MFA, and what applications are on MFA, and are they conditional access? There's a whole slew of things that would need to be subordinate to just that one question, and there's a list of them on the insurance underwriting questionnaire. It's really taken over the way that people think about their risk, because it is so easy to transfer some of that to cyber risk insurance. But we've seen that nation state actors and ransomware and social engineering, which amount for the preponderance of cybersecurity incidents, often aren't covered by cybersecurity insurance. The last one is, as I mentioned before, we've lost the vernacular a bit. I mentioned earlier that when I talk about risk in organizations, that regularly they repeat back to me a vulnerability as it's a risk. And the way in which we tend to talk past each other, especially as security technologists, in our dogmas of the way that we think about things, we've lost some of the common vernacular in order to be able to articulate what's happening. Vulnerabilities and risks are not the same thing. One is a subset of the other. To continue on, I think that the burden is on me to articulate why risk is so important for organizations. So the first one is resources are continually becoming scarce, whether it's recession planning or whether it's shrinking budgets or the resources. 715,000 open roles is even outdated as of right now. I think it's updated to 760,000 open roles. And climbing, it's continually climbing. So the resources are going away. In the same sense, the costs, license costs are going up. Salaries for cybersecurity team members are going up and continuing to climb as the open roles continue to climb. We're going to have a really hard time in the relatively near future talk about why we need to continue to spend what we need to spend on. We need to justify it initially when we ask for it. And if the board member and the business leaders are astute, they're going to regularly come back to us and ask us to defend its value 6 months after, 12 months after. And that value, there's only so many ways to properly articulate it. I didn't receive value of my technology investment just because I consumed all the licenses. I need to see that it's substantially reduced the risk of our organization, equivalent to the amount of spend that we had to go against. And the last one's a little bit loaded, but it's the right amount of resources on the right thing. That's open-ended intentionally, but there's really only so many ways for us to be able to articulate right on right. I have a proposal for how to jump into that here. I mentioned right amount. We believe that the right amount is articulated in risk. And I mentioned before, as we walk from theoretical and probable all the way down into the actual tangible kinesthetic, what can I do about it right now? One of those things is have us orientate on the risk-based, threat-informed articulation of our security technology. And if we do that right, that risk articulation should transcend the tactical level, the operational level, and the strategic level of organization. For example, I should be able to articulate that risk to the analyst and what it means to the analyst on a regular day basis. I should be able to articulate it to the manager and the director about what levers they can pull based on that risk and based on the controls that we're going to put in order to mitigate that risk. And I should be able to articulate what it actually means for bottom line at the business level, to the C-suite, to the board. All of those things, if I'm doing risk properly, I should be able to hit all of the separate levels with the same risk. And it has articulations at different levels that mean different things to the different groups. The way I think we can do this best is by, not trying to swallow all of the risk equals threat times vulnerability times asset or consequence or severity and likelihood or even capability, but really focus on the intent. Being able to focus on the intent, being able to understand, like I talked about the anecdote with my house and my car, is being able to have a solid understanding of the intent that's going against our organization. I believe that's where we can separate the wheat from the chaff, and that's how it brings down into theoretical versus probable. Let's continue to dive in a little bit more. So if you're going to go ahead on this journey, if you heard what I was saying and believe it to be true, there's a certain amount of things that are foundational, really non-negotiable in order to be able to take the first step. The first one is you have to have a risk register. If you are not managing a risk register, but think that you're articulating risk properly, you're probably misaligned. You need to have a risk register, and it needs to articulate the risk properly, and it needs to articulate what success for the control properly. There's a handful of frameworks out there that are helpful. There's some sample Excel spreadsheets. We run ours on an Excel spreadsheet. It's an easy way to be able to articulate it properly. It's a fancy Excel spreadsheet, but it's an Excel spreadsheet nonetheless, and how we go ahead and manage that. So that's non-negotiable. We need to have a risk register. Ideally, that's a quantitative risk register. But if all we can do is get to a qualitative, that's a good crawl step in the journey. A next one is we have to be able to leverage intel. When I think about threat and when I think about intent, which are the things that I put forward that are really real differentiators for the proper risk discipline, all of that centers around intel. I don't know how to do it otherwise. We need to be able to have decent intel in order for us to make a decent assessment on what the intent of that specific threat is and what the capability is. I can't quantify threat at all if I can't actually get down to into a threat via capability and intent component at all. I need to have a way to ingest vulnerabilities onto the register. One of the easiest ways to get started with a risk register is through your TVM. There's a handful of ways in order to be able to get onto the risk register. That's part of the process. The easiest one is to start with what your TVM is producing. If you do a scan and there's a bunch of vulnerabilities, pop those vulnerabilities up there, and then we can align them against what the asset is, and then we can start articulating a threat. That's the 101 way to be able to do this. It's really hard if you don't have a TVM. And like manner, if I have the vulnerability, the next question is what the asset is against that. And CIS 1 and 2 are great ways to start. We've needed hardware inventory, we've needed software inventory. We know those to be foundational capabilities. And if I have my TVM and if I have my CIS 1 and 2 put together, I already have 2/3 of the risk articulation. And I'm now, like I said before, I'm left with figuring out what the main threat component is. But as we tackle this, it's going to be really hard to jump on the threat capability if we're still working on these foundational basics. I'll dive a little bit more into Intel because it really is a challenge, but it's really critical for the threat component. So all of that to set up theoretical versus probable. If I don't have intent, then I don't have threat. If I don't have threat, then I don't have risk. And if I can't figure any of those things out, I resort. My only option is the what if game. And this is where the preponderance of our cybersecurity discipline lives on a regular basis. Well, what if this threat? I know that it's feasibly possible. So what if this and what if this? What if an attacker does this? Or what if an insider does this? Those are all great threat modeling exercises. But those what ifs should not drive our spend. Those what ifs should not drive the way in which we prioritize resources. And this comes down to Intel. Intel guides us for all of the inputs versus the primary output. When we think about Intel in the military context, Jackson mentioned my military background. So the military does Intel very, very well. When we think about Intel in the military context, we really define quality Intel by the ability of a decision maker to make a decision off of that Intel. It's not based on how long the Intel report is. It's not even based on depth of the Intel. It's based on the decision maker's ability to do something with that Intel, which implies that Intel at the different levels, strategic, operational, tactical, have different voices to that Intel because the decision maker is different. But if I'm left without Intel, if I'm left without an assessment, I have no other option besides going against the what if. I have no other option besides putting out all of the advanced persistent threat landscape, all of the criminal actor landscape, and then hoping that the tools in which I've invested in land on the proper ones, and hope that my investment covers the one in which an attacker is going to be able to is going to actually go against my organization. I'll give a short story about the way that the military does this. When I was teaching at the weapons school, we had these injects in major operations, and one of the injects that I was supervising as the cyber warfare instructor was we were injecting a effect into the commander's operations center during a major exercise. Knowing that this has some risk into it, we de-risk it accordingly. But that inject was, we changed all the computers to show something different. And it was very, very distracting. And the learning objective was, all I wanted the commander to do was turn around and look at his intel officer and ask for an assessment. What is the enemy in this case? What is the threat trying to do to us? And if they had asked that question, they probably would have realized that what the threat was trying to do, if they just sat down and thought about it for a few seconds, was not to cause a major disruption during the operation, but it was to cause a major distraction. The difference between distraction and disruption then for that commander is very, very different levers. If they think about it as a disruption, they're going to focus on getting all those streams back up to where they're supposed to be. And that's frankly what happened 9 out of 10 times. But the 1 out of 10 who realized that it was just a distraction just turned off the monitors and operated the entire exercise by radio, which is the core portion of our discipline. Very different decisions. But they wouldn't have got on to that unless they were able to think about the assessment. Quality intel is defined by the ability of a decision maker to make a decision off of it. If I don't have that, I have no other option besides this theoretical what if. All of the options that could happen against our organization, and I don't have the ability to find the needle in the haystack or to find the probable. In like manner, when we do operational assessments, we articulate most likely course of action versus most dangerous course of action. That's a great way to be able to sift through all of the opportunities that could happen into the ones that are most likely or most dangerous. Those I can plan for. Those now give me the ability as a decision maker to pull the levers that I need. So that's where risk goes down to threat, goes down into intent, even tighter, which is how we can start navigating the theoretical versus the probable. So at Ascent, we want to integrate this into all security operations, all of them. And the modern SOC has evolved. You'll see this concept throughout a handful of organizations that are articulating the modern SOC. This is our articulation of it, and it is really solid. But you'll see here that Intel is deeply integrated into the other aspects that are commonly security operations. I'm sure you're familiar with the blue. I'm sure you're familiar with the red. The green is detection engineering or CI/CD, SOAR. That would all fit within that green. But Intel is up at the top, and Intel's feeding all of the other ones. And if I were to pull Intel out of the framework, I would be significantly missing on how to properly feed the blue and how to properly respond via the red and how to integrate with the green. I lose all of it. Intel really sits at the core of this modern security operations. I also think that if you're listening to this and come up with one of two objections, I'll list two objections. One of them is, Jason, that's a great idea. Only the top organizations can do that. Only the ones with the most amount of money. Only the ones with the best resources. Only the ones with all of the former Marines who actually understand Intel can actually do that. Your ask, Jason, is too high. To that, I would say I very much understand that. Very much understand that it is definitely a challenge. One, you can find organizations that provide services that do things like Ascent. So shameless plug there. Alternatively, though, you can inject Intel at the most basic level. Start small. Start with a small amount of team that has a small amount of open source intelligence, jump on Feedly, pull in Twitter feeds, and start trying to integrate how that intelligence actually operates against your TBM, against your CIS 1 and 2. The second objection is we have a bunch of feeds, and we just don't know how to use them. That one I'm very sympathetic to. I think the fact of the matter is we are just now getting to the point in the field. I talked about how it's very young, but we're just now getting to the point in the field where we have enough data to be able to make a legitimate security assessment. Where we can start saying, I don't know what's exactly going against my organization, but I do know what is going against my industry. And that brings it from a vast amount of what ifs into a much smaller amount of what ifs, where I can start pulling those levers and start trying to operationalize that capability in our organization. So I understand the objections. certainly valid, but I think that they are overcome. So where to start? The first one is my ask to you is to start operationalizing threat frameworks rather than simply compliance frameworks. I'm not asking you to remove compliance frameworks. I know they're very important. They're very important to your business. But if you have this much importance in your compliance framework, I want you to have at least this much importance in your threat framework. Being able to integrate those into the way you think about your organization, your risk, your cybersecurity mitigations on a regular basis. The second one is to start bringing in threat frameworks like MITRE ATT&CK. It's a great way to start. It's a great way to lens. It's a great way to articulate that side of the threat component, and it's become really a standard framework that it's easy to consume. There's probably some MITRE ATT&CK threat frameworks that are built into your EDR. There's probably some MITRE ATT&CK threat frameworks that are built into your SIEM. Ways in which you can start very simply. This is one of the reasons why I think the Microsoft Defender for Endpoint and Azure Sentinel are phenomenal starts. These are built in. They're built in articulations against the way in which you can lens these against your organization. If you have the TVM, you have the vulnerability component. If you have CIS 1 and 2 put together, which again, you can leverage something like Intune in order to pull those in, and Defender to pull those in, you have 2/3 of the equation. Now let's lens what's built into those other capabilities to get on to a full risk articulation. Start threat modeling. That's another ask. The what ifs are important. I talked negatively about them a little bit, but the what ifs are really important. But they're important in the right context. As we sit down and think about all of the threat models that go against our industry, or go against our asset, or go against a vulnerability, that's the appropriate place for a threat model. The appropriate place to talk about all the what ifs are when we're bringing them onto the risk register so that we can determine whether or not the capability and the intent, those are the what ifs that we want to bring forward, are high likely against the vulnerability in the asset. And the other ask is to consider a map versus a guide. I'm an avid hunter. It's coming hunting season up in Minnesota. And when I think about going to a new location on public land, I think it's great to be able to hunt public land. So when I think about going to a new location, I could do a few things. I could get a map. I have a bunch of maps. I have them on my phone. I plot them all, and I can do all of the work beforehand. But nothing beats getting a guide. Nothing beats getting somebody who's gone to that exact same place, who knows exactly where to go, to be able to guide you along. So if, as we've been thinking through this, you think to yourself, you know what, we have the right map. I have it built in my tools. I know how to go forward. By all means, we want to save the world from cybersecurity threats. Go forth and do great things. But if you need a guide, come find a guide to be able to bring this forward a little bit. This is one of the ways in which Ascent Guides. We have a capability that we have built to lens this against your landscape. And I'm not going to go into a product pitch, but this is one iteration. This is one iteration of what it can look like to lens the threat component against the vulnerability component against the asset component. Only here can we really start getting into a full risk articulation from beginning to end. Only here, when we have that intent of a threat, can I start moving away from all of the what ifs of theoretical onto the very specific probabilities that are going against our organization. So with that, I'd like to open it up to questions.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Jason. Appreciate it. I found this incredibly insightful for a variety of different reasons, but I think the thing that my biggest takeaway is from this session is there's things that you can go and do today to be able to increase your security posture and focusing specifically on threat, whether it's risk registers that are in very advanced Excel spreadsheets, all the way down to being able to drive spend, being able to take that threat-based approach to how it is that you would be making security investments. So I thought this was super informative. I wanted to kick off questions with what it is that I actually read in a blog post that you put up the other day, Jason, where we're focusing on cyber threat actors and defenders. They're always focused on some sort of typically focused on some sort of financial impact in the industry. And so when we're talking about financial impact, I can't help but think of the current economic environment that we're in right now. There's looming recession coming, resource constraints that you touched on earlier are becoming harder to come by. And so this is a bit of a two-part question I want to get us kicked off with is, from your perspective, how have the changes in the current economic environment and the threat of imminent recession that we're seeing change how threat actors are targeting organizations? But then the second half of this question is, what changes should be implemented to defend against these changes in threat patterns properly?
Yeah. So the first way that I'll answer that is when I mentioned threat modeling. And one of the really easy starts that I think about when we get to threat modeling is to remind ourselves that bad guys have bosses and budgets too. And because they have bosses and budgets too, one of the best ways for us to figure out the probability, one of the best ways to figure out the threat modeling is to work from monetization backwards. So I think that's really what you're articulating is how is this threat trying to monetize? A good example is when we go into a financial organization, how are they trying to get to actual account numbers? Or when we go into manufacturing, how are they trying to get into intellectual property? Certainly, a lot of those threats cross in organizations. Not everybody, not every industry has just one monetization method. But it's super important for us to be able to work from monetization backwards in order to figure out what they're actually trying to accomplish. They have bosses and budgets too. And because they have bosses and budgets too, one of the things that drives is it's too expensive to go after a modern organization. So it's a bit of a hot take, but the general summary around that is it is very easy to go after old systems. It is very easy to go after out-of-date operating systems. It's very easy to go after legacy infrastructure. It's very easy to go after the VPN organization where everything's flat and accessible once I get in. Those are super easy. So making sure that you're not the slowest buffalo is an important way to make sure that when you go against a threat that has a boss and a budget, that you are not the easy target. That you are making it expensive for them. That if they want to legitimately target you, there's a significant amount of resources and a significant amount of time, and eventually they have to walk off because it's too expensive to continue on. They have to find something that monetizes quicker. So that's the lens in which I generally think about it. I don't know if that answered both of your questions or just the one. If not, let me know and I'll continue.
No, yeah, that was helpful. You're talking about essentially modernization as a security effort, right? We talk about that quite frequently to be able to make attacking more difficult for threat actors by modernizing, right? Because to your point earlier, threat actors tend to go after the slowest buffalo. That's my favorite analogy to use, by the way. That's my personal favorite. And when we talk about modernization, right, that's also a business driver too, right? Cybersecurity, I've got a Gartner report in front of me. A Gartner survey found that 72% of business executives are mapping cybersecurity investments to business outcomes. Cybersecurity is not just a function of security of itself. It's a driver for the entirety of the business. So the question that I want to ask is, how does taking a risk-based approach to security support the entirety of the business, not just IT, not just security, but the business as a whole? How does that drive? How does taking that risk-based perspective support the business in of itself?
Yeah, I think that's the varsity level of getting all the way to risk. Is I can start with the assets I mentioned before that a good way to map against the asset of the consequence is by using CIS 1 or 2. That's the crawl phase. The walk phase is probably working against critical infrastructure, where I say, I know my crown jewels are, therefore those are going to be my assets, and I map those. But even in that crawl and walk, I'm at IT. I'm limited to the realm of IT. The varsity level is when I have replaced that asset or that consequence with legitimate business outcome, top line, bottom line, something that substantially changes the way that our business operates. That's the varsity level. So because I wholeheartedly agree with that, with Gardner's assessment there, organizations are trying really hard to be able to articulate cybersecurity spend against business outcome. There is no better way to be able to do that than with your risk register. By bringing those assets, by bringing that business outcome, top line, bottom line articulation onto the risk register, and then mapping that against legitimate vulnerabilities and legitimate threats. It takes a bit of a few tries before you're there where you can properly articulate that, but that's the goal. That's the outcome. That's why risk register is important. That's why threat is important. That's why risk articulation and quantification is so important, is because everybody's trying to bring forward why cybersecurity is valuable. If you can't do that, we're just going to fall back onto what Professor Alatzko said, which is cybersecurity is not very important. So I think that if nothing else, validates why this approach is really so critical.
Oh yeah, that's great. The fact that cybersecurity isn't important, right? That's where we started, and we're bringing it to be able to support the business. So I think that's super insightful. I'm going to ask my last question, then we'll jump into the chat to see if there's anything else. But let's say that we're in a situation where an organization has decided, you know what, okay, we're going to take this risk-focused approach to security. We've already taken some of these initial steps that you've talked about earlier in the discussion earlier. I think a lot of times security leaders are facing pressure from the broader of the business to be able to report progress and to be able to quantify that progress, right? Sticking with the theme of 8th grade algebra. So if a security leader is being asked from the organization, how are we doing? What progress are we making? What practical steps do you have to offer to quantify the progress in the security journey from a security perspective? How can these security leaders be proving that they are making progress from a risk-based security perspective?
Yeah, so that's actually the missing component of the majority of templates that are out there that I found. So when we go to the risk register, it should have the identified risk, risk ID, short articulation of what the risk is, and then it should have threat, vulnerability, asset that's properly articulated and quantified. That's the first half of the risk register. You'll find a lot of templates out there that have that. The problem is that's only valuable if I can also measure the residual risk. And in most organizations, that ends up being a whole separate process, but they need to line up. It needs to be that I have this risk articulation, and this risk is a 900. And then as I continue the line across there, I have this control and this control and this control. And then I do the measurement again. After this control, what's the residual threat vulnerability asset? After this control, what's the residual threat vulnerability asset? And same again. And then when I get to the end, I have what a key performance indicator or a key success indicator is going to be that says, how do I know I've dropped it down to the acceptable level of risk? And then and only then, when I've measured that the control's in place, that it's met the KPI, and that it's dropped the appropriate amount, can I take it off the risk register? Until then, until it's met that value, the value in which I purchased that technology for the beginning, or the value in which I put the control in place in the very beginning, then and only then can I take it off. If I do that all the way across, and if I can chain them all the way across, then I have an easy way to articulate it. It is, we started with this very high risk. We articulated what the residual risk was going to be after the control, and then we articulated what the acceptable level of risk was. And then now, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months later, we've met what the acceptable level of risk was, and we can measure it, and we can show it, and I can prove it. I can prove it. I can show the value all the way through. So great question. I think that's another validation of why we need to exercise this process. and not just the budget articulation process. We need to exercise this process. But there's not a lot of templates out there that really bring it all the way forward. I've done them where we've split that into two separate exercises. That's fine, as long as they connect together, as long as you can connect the IDs together. You can build a database for it. Some compliance frameworks allow you to be able to put some of those components in there. But either way, it needs to be done. It needs to be done beginning to end.
Beginning to end. Yeah, that sounds great. I'm going to read a couple of questions that we received in the chat from the audience. So we're going to start with this first one here. How important are CTI cyber threat intelligence feeds? Does it depend on the size of my organization, or is it always a good idea to prioritize threat intel even with a small team?
Good question. I don't want to jump on a CTI soapbox, so I'm just going to step on it a little bit. I've gone in organizations where I put forward this proposal, same proposal. Prioritize risk, orient on the threat, and then specifically on the intent. And the response I get back is, we have 50 feeds. We've bought 50 CTI feeds. Great. What do you do with them? How do you operationalize them? How do you integrate them? What do you do with those feeds? Do they just connect into your SIM somehow and then they automate something? Is anybody looking at them? And then that's where we depart our point of view. So it's usually, well, I think they connect into our SIM, or I think that person over there that sits over there looks at them. And we've lost all operationalization of this this intel capability. So CTI has intel in it. That doesn't mean you're doing intelligence. And it doesn't mean you can make a decision off of it. That needs to be curated. And then this is really where the military has put forward a great process and be able to do intelligence preparation in the battle space and intelligence products that bring them up into an organization. They're figuring out how to do this within cyber, and they're getting pretty good at it. Industry is still a little bit behind in this case. The military has just been doing intel for a very long time, and organizations need to start adopting some of those operationalization practices, even down to the very anecdotal, the commander or the decision maker, the CISO. When something is happening, looking for an assessment. That's a good indicator that we've operationalized this appropriately. What is happening? What is the likelihood? When Log4j drops, the question doesn't necessarily need to be how pervasive is it? That's a vulnerability question. The question needs to be, what is the assessment against our organization? What is the intent against our organization? That's a very different lens into how to bring that forward in a very tactical way.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's great. I appreciate the idea of being able to. It's great that you have a bunch of CTI feeds right in your environment, but what is it that you're actually doing with it? I think that makes those more practical and more actionable as well. The next question that we're looking at here is, can you walk us through how well we are doing and where the industry is at? From what you are seeing, how are organizations tackling risk in the market as a whole?
How well we're doing. I don't think we're doing very well. I think I put that a little bit forward. I think that we've undervalued the discipline as a whole. And maybe even more specifically, we've undervalued the science. We've undervalued the science behind what risk is. There's certainly an art aspect. That's part of that guttural what if feeling. That's part of the art for sure. But we have definitely undervalued the science. And I think that has allowed us to deviate from standard practices, standard vernacular, standard processes in which we can articulate. And we've fell onto risk transfer through cyber insurance, and we fell onto budget articulation rather than risk articulation. And part of that is we're fulfilling our own destiny because we set up that we've set the expectation that that's the way that we should be articulating our value, and I think it's time to start articulating it in a higher level way.
That's great. I'm going to ask one of my own questions then, because the question that we just answered made me want to think about the question I thought of earlier is, what prerequisites or foundational pieces should be in place for organizations to leverage a probable threat-based approach to security? What key foundational concrete components should be in place to be able to get started on a threat-based approach to security?
Yeah. The non-negotiables: have to have a risk register, got to have a TVM, got to start figuring out how to pull in the intel. I recommend that you articulate that against MITRE ATT&CK. That's probably the easiest way to do it. In fact, I'd probably go one step further. That's probably the best way to do it right now within the model. And the last one is we have to know what the asset articulation is. I mentioned that there's a crawl, a walk, and a run stage. If you are prepared to go directly to articulating it against the business value, great. That's definitely the run stage. If you have all of your crown jewel analysis well documented and well done, great. That's a good walk stage. And then if you don't have any of that, you probably are making some progress on your CIS 1 and 2, your hardware and software inventories, and that is an acceptable place to start. Don't let progress get in the way of, or perfection get in the way of progress. That's a great place to start. That's starting the discipline. That's starting the articulation. That's starting, even working throughout your organization and how you can re-engage this discipline in your cybersecurity practice.
Great. We got another question in the chat. I'll read this here. How would you approach evaluating non-monetary based actors, which have been more active as of the last 4 to 5 years, versus a ransomware particular type?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the themes at Black Hat this year was, and this is a quote, we have fetishized the advanced persistent threat. And in that process, we have lost sight of the criminal actor. I think that is absolutely true, and evidenced by 12-foot tall APT dolls that are at Black Hat in the past couple of years. We're certainly very interested in an action figure of Cozy Bear, and have lost sight of the criminal actor. What I would say is the criminal actor is probably the ones who have been the most active, and they're probably the ones who have really brought a handful of challenge forward in the past couple of years. I would generally associate that with the criminal actor. I think the advanced persistent threat is certainly something to be aware of. And although attribution is really, really hard, we tend to do recursive attribution throughout the way in which we name whether or not it's a criminal actor or an advanced persistent threat. It's very possible a criminal actor that's supported by an advanced persistent threat. Those are all out there and all exist. But the way that I would try to most clearly answer that is I believe the criminal actor is the one who's been owning us lately, and I would probably have them be, I would associate them as a monetary threat. They're looking to monetize something. The other ones, the script kiddies, the hacktivists, I think that they're active, definitely active. But when we really sit down and do the risk articulation, they don't necessarily pose the same amount of threat for the same reasons that we put forward. So the way that I generally like to articulate the threat is put it into the capability and intent access, and really assess both of those, and it puts it on a slanted scoring model. I think that's the easiest way to be able to do it. That gives us a solid number. But I'd probably still bring forward that criminal actor is the one that's been the most dangerous the past couple of years.
That's great. Yeah, I appreciate the insight. I wanted to ask one more question, and then I wanted to be able to make sure that we're executing against next steps properly. This last question is, what's the first practical step organizations should take to implement risk into their security strategy? If you had to pick the first practical step, the one step, what would that be?
Become familiar with MITRE ATT&CK. Have that be vernacular. That's probably the most impactful one. I mentioned a couple other foundational ones, but in terms of impact, get really good with MITRE ATT&CK framework. It'll probably change the way in which you think about threats as a whole.
Great. Awesome. Well, I appreciate your time today, Jason. Yeah, I found this incredibly insightful, all the way from what are the things that we could be doing right now to be able to take a risk-based approach to what are the things that should be considered down the road. How do we prepare ourselves to be focused on threat? I found this super interesting. So thank you. Thank you for your time. Wanted to thank everybody that participated today. Obviously, you took an hour out of your day to spend some time with us to be able to chat further about how we would approach a risk-based stance to security. And we want to continue the conversation, right? So if you have any additional questions, anything that we can continue to be able to support from a security perspective, reach out to Jason, reach out to myself. The individual that invited you to this session today will be reaching out as a follow-up to make sure that we're able to support next steps and continuing the discussion. We've got assets that we're going to be able to arm you with to be able to make sure that we're moving the ball forward with achieving our objective, which is to save the world from cyber.